Hello, 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 and welcome to Pop Culture Therapy. I'm Cruellica Kain, a little nervous right now that
I'm just figuring move it closer for you.
Kaiju Okami's going to break everything. But hello and welcome to our next installment of Halloween month. I will say Halloween month means very little to me because I deal with Halloween 365 days a year. Basically, if Halloween Town was something real, I would be there. But thank you very much for everyone joining me today. So, as the title is, this is Cruellica Kain's Horror Time. I wanted to share some fun things about horror. It's books, movies, anime, tokusatsu, the whole gambit of different things. If you're unfamiliar, this is part of our pop culture series. Typically, we do these as podcasts. I haven't been keeping up with it too often, but I'm trying to get back into it. But let's go ahead and get started. Hello. So, I wanted to just kind of talk about my little background and history with horror. So, I have been a horror fan over for near 40 years, which is amazing because I'm only 25. But all kidding aside, I've been a huge horror fan because when I was about 5 years old, I watched Nightmare on Elm Street when it first came out. And I will say that was probably not the right idea for a little kid to watch. Um, Probably really bad parenting on my mom's part. It's not like she knew and she wasn't around at that point, but I love this movie and it's really what got me into enjoying horror movies and different things like that. And from there, I had an opportunity as I got older to really take control and start buying more horror I wanted. Like a lot of the horror I really got into as a kid was actually surprisingly more so on the book side. I watched horror movies, but being that I was younger and I didn't have a lot of money, I couldn't always go out and buy the horror stuff I wanted movie wise because my parents were going to pay attention. So whenever I surprisingly for outside of the Nightmare on Elm Street one. So that was like a really weird experience to have. And then, so I was able to go to like a library and get all the horror books that I ever wanted to get and kind of take advantage of that. But one of the things that I absolutely love about horror, and I'll definitely love any questions, comments that everyone has, but the thing I love about horror is the fact that you can have those thrills and chills. And it doesn't have to be a part of the entire series. It can just be like an element of it. And yes, Star Wars fan laws were way different back then in the 80s when it came to horror. So what I really wanted to get into first was talking about the horror elements of what really drives people to like horror, especially during the Halloween season where it can be creepy and scary. And essentially, like you hear during the first Scream movie, do you like scary movies? And I think Halloween time is that one time a year all horror fans are like, yes, I can watch as many horror movies as I want right now, and nobody is going to look at us like we're weird. Problem is for me, I watch horror movies year round. And then when I got into tokusatsu, I actually had an opportunity to watch more than just traditional horror movies or simple anime. I got to actually see series that had horror themes in it. Like when you have Ryuki, the first series I actually watched for Toku, that was your main characters were a dragon and a bat. And you had mirror monsters that would kill people. Like early in the series, you have a spider that pulls people into the mirrors with its webbing. And you're like, how? How does this even get by on television for kids? And I was so jealous because when I watched it, I was already in my early 20s. And I'm like, kids watch this and it's okay. But when in the 80s, we had like a great way of putting it is we had Skeletor and we had Mumra from Batman, not Batman, wow, from He-Man and the Thundercats, respectively. But it's not like we had too many scary things. And then in the 90s is where we really got Goosebumps, Eerie, Indiana, Are You Afraid of the Dark? So many like horror themed kid shows, but they were still very pulled back. So I ended up watching when I did get into having the ability to watch more stuff with my friends, we would watch like Tales from the Crypt or oh god, I can't remember so many other things, but we love this. Gravity Falls is definitely one of those series that makes me jealous because it wasn't around when I was a kid. But but I see it now and it has so many more horror themes. And so in the 80s, we had this renaissance of horror, but it was all for adult audiences. Kids watched it. I watched it. I've seen before the age of 10, I saw a good portion of the Friday the 13th movies, Nightmare on Elm Street movies, the Halloween movies, Prom Night, Psycho, Texas Chainsaw, and a few of its sequels, Child's Play, so many horror movies because my friends would I would pool money together and get VHS tapes from Blockbuster, Video Factory, and all that shit. But rather than digressing, the really, really cool thing is the fact that when we did get into Toku, because Power Rangers really didn't do anything horror related, but when we got into Toku, it was one of those fascinating things of, okay, finally, there's something else out there that can connect to horror fans, but also give kids an opportunity to be a little frightened um, and see something new. My favorite horror movie still to this day is Nightmare on Elm Street because it was the first I watched and it was the most fun for me. I wanted to share, along with talking about all the different things, some of the horror movies or series that really help continue to keep me in that frame of mind of being the horror fan I am today. So I'm going to actually start with some of the series that I grew up with as a kid. And that's actually going to be the books. So the first book I actually ever read of Stephen King was It. And the reason I read this is because I am definitely one of those children from the 90s when the miniseries for It came out with Tim Curry. I ate it up. And to be truthful, I was actually a fan of clowns. Like, I liked clowns as a little kid. I had so many statuettes of clowns, things like that. It freaked me the fuck out when it came to clowns. And so I read this book after watching the miniseries because I really wanted to understand what the differences were, because a lot of the adults I knew talked about the book and would mention, oh, this is different from the book, that's different from the book, and everything in every way. So I, at the very gentle age of 11, began reading this massive book. And when Kaiju sees how big this book is half the time, he doesn't understand how my premature adolescent brain could do this. And this is not the longest book I've read, because I've also read The Stand by Stephen King, which I actually read that before watching the miniseries. So if you think I'm FUBAR, yes, I promise you I am. And then all of these books for Stephen King, with The Shining, Carrie, and Salem's Lot, I took advantage of reading these as a kid, because the one thing I value about horror, that I hope other people do as well, if you're horror fans, is that it gives you a sense of escapism. It gives you a chance to face the monsters and not be afraid of hiding in the dark with them. And so that's why I've always enjoyed horror. And when I became a teenager and I started working, the first thing I actually found, and sadly this is not the original, was Devilman. When I found out about Go Nagai and his demonic series of Devilman, it was actually with the OVA series first. The OVA is what drove me to get this, the main series, and enjoy the fact that you have a story where it's demons against demons. And I absolutely loved it. And horror in that regard to me was beyond fun. It was beyond anything I could do. And then I would get into Junji Ito with Uzumaki, Spiral. And I'm like, this is so cool. And then when I got into anime, so anime for me, compared to a lot of other fans, I watched anime, but I didn't necessarily know it was anime, because I either watched really shitty dubs on USA, Stars, what have you. And it's not like they really advertised anime until I just graduated high school, and Dragon Ball had just come out in the or Dragon Ball Z had come out in the United States. It was super popular. It was late 90s. And that's where people talked about anime. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I watched anime, but while I like Dragon Ball, I like Sailor Moon, the problem for me is there wasn't animes that spoke to my demonic soul, so to speak. Um, so I then found, by happenstance, oh God, I have to find it. So I found by happenstance a few little things that were coming out in the early 2000s. Not Danganronpa, I promise you that. In the early 2000s, there was some series called Higurashi, as well as a series by Satoshi Kon called Paranoia Agents. So, Paranoia Agents, if you have not watched this series, it is a combination of supernatural, slasher, and just, I would say, in certain elements of torture porn, for an animated series with the character Lil Slugger, who, even if he is not the litness of being the most villainous character, he definitely helps drive a lot of the insanity. Along with that, and apparently I don't have it out here, or I do, I also had the chance to watch Boogie Pop Phantom. Boogie Pop Phantom is one of those series that really plays with your mind. It is not in chronological order. It is not told ever in chronological order. I actually feel like if somebody were to chop the series up and put it in chronological order, it would actually be kind of boring. Because one of the things that's really great about this particular anime is you're left confused, you're left isolated from really what the story is trying to tell you, and you never know what is going to happen next. And that to me is really what profoundly makes horror. Um, Now, after I got into all of that horror for anime, I started dating Kaiju no Kami, and due to us dating in the early 2000s, was that I got to watch all the Godzilla movies. I got to rewatch, even though I've seen them all, I got to rewatch it through another perspective, all of the Universal monster films. And that's where tokusatsu came in. And tokusatsu brought me another perspective that I hadn't thought about, because every time people think tokusatsu, they think of Super Sentai because of the Power Rangers element. Or if you have to explain to people what tokusatsu is, you have to say, oh, it's like Power Rangers in America, but it's the original. It's the only way you can competently, and to Kaiju's frustration, explain it to non fans. But with that, we got the opportunity to experience, I think, one of the best special effects horror series ever, and that is Sky High. The movie has been released in the US long ago, really terrible quality still, but the original series, which we have from Japan because we actually spent the money and bought it, this is a series that talks about really Japan's Shinto belief of heaven or hell, of there you either die and go to hell or lose your soul, or you die and are reborn, because reincarnation is very impactful for them. It's not really like the Christian belief that you go into paradiso. Um, so watching this series, I appreciated it wholeheartedly, because one, it had a lot of toku actors that you get familiarized with when you're watching like Kamen Rider Sentai, but at the same time, you actually get something that not made for kids, it's made for adults, that really takes in horror and gives you a place to live with it and to live for it. Then we also got to watch this OVA series called Petite Cosette, which is in licensed hell and has never been re-released in the United States except for this one lovely copy of a DVD where everything is put into one disc. I will say it really plays with your mind because you're playing with a picture. Um, but overall, getting into the tokusatsu element, these series really had things that played with horror for Ryuki and Kuga. Then you have it with Blade, Thighs, Agito, and you even could go up to the most recent series of looking at Gaim or looking at Revice, or even previous to that, going with Kiva, where you have this series that has these hellish characters that make you wonder what is out there, what is good, what is bad, and how many people we can kill all at the exact same time. So horror is everywhere. I think when you look at it in that way, just from all the examples, there's so much out there. And truthfully, this is not in our entire collection. Um, we have a lot of horror that really can make you think, make you escape, and make you have fun. So I wanted to just kind of, and sorry, I didn't have like a plan. I expected first and foremost that kaiju would be joining me. So since Sebastian hasn't joined me, I am just kind of going through background first. And now I want to share some of the highlights of why, if you're not a horror fan and you're not a fan of being scared, why horror can still work for you. So thinking on the lines of horror, there's three core concepts that come into play. One is terror, one is mystery, and one is survival. Or third is survival. So terror, mystery, and survival. Those are all the three core concepts of horror. Anything can terrify you because it's that fear of the unknown with humanity. It's the fight or flight syndrome. Mystery is trying to figure out how you go from having everything happen as it should and going into this hateful filled realm, so to speak, where you don't know why things are happening. And then survival. The biggest thing about any horror film is either the final girl or the final guy or just the final survivors. Somebody has to survive to tell the story on further. And hello for any newcomers. Hopefully you're able to join. Hopefully I haven't bored the shit out of anyone before. My goal is to be entertaining. This is my first live stream by myself, so take pity on me. So if you're afraid of being scared when it comes to horror, but still like the mystery element, still like the survival, watching someone get beyond a tragedy of some sort, think of like horror comedies out there. I personally think that Cannibal Holocaust is a horror comedy, but it's truthfully not, so don't watch it. But if you're scared of being freaked out. But think of like Cabin in the Woods. That is a great horror comedy. Because you have nothing to be scared about because they take a lot of the bite away from you. You also have, truthfully, 13 ghosts. In all honesty, with 13 ghosts, the entire family survives. I probably am spoiling it for you, but truthfully, both versions of the bloody movie have been around for decades. But look at horror comedies. You could even go with Warm Bodies, which is a horror romantic comedy. And there's not going to be anything, there's going to be blood and death and things like that, because unfortunately you can't escape that with horror unless you watch Tales from the Crypt Keeper. But you're still going to have that. You're still going to have a little bit of terror, but not as much to frighten you. Now, if you're not a fan of mystery, that's where you can go with, but you like being scared or terrified and you like seeing survival, this is where you can go with your tried and true slashers. Go with, not the first Friday the 13th. Go with the second Friday the 13th and on beyond. Go with the second plus Halloween movies. The reason I'm not calling out the first is because both of them have mystery. Go with Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. While they have a tinge of mystery, it's primarily killing people. You can also go with, trying to think of the best way of putting this. You can go with some of the Saw movies, even though I would say some of the Saw movies are even better because you really don't have survival. You could also go with Hostel, The Last Exorcist, pretty much most of the found footage films. They take out a lot of the mystery because you're watching it through the character's eyes. Any of the paranormal or Paranormal Activities movies, except for, I think it's the final one, the Ghost I can't remember the title, but all of those are going to take out the mystery because it's tried and true right in your face. If you want to take out survival, this is where you're going to go with the torture porn franchises. Yes, Hostel, I've already mentioned for the mystery aspect, but you can go with all this torture porn, and Cannibal Holocaust is a great. Anywhere you're going to have a series that, or movie or franchise where you're going to have no survivors. Even the Ju-on series is great because, yes, supposedly you have kind of a survivor at the end of the Ju-on or Grudge series, but really, you're not getting out of the series alive. The same thing for the Ringu or the Ring, or so the Ringu, Ring, or the Ring American series. You also don't have survivors there. Yes, you kind of did in the first American movie. You could say the same for the Japanese movie, but truthfully, you're not getting out alive with the way the story's going to go. Technically, It Follows is a great movie where you're technically not going to have any survivors. Yes, you do at the end because of how the story ends, but truthfully, they're still at risk for dying because if everybody else dies before them, you still are at risk. So when you have those three categories, you always have to look at how they're going to play off of each other, how they're going to work together, how they're going to go against each other. And with all of the examples of why I got into horror, what I do, I always have to look at all three together. For me personally, I am not a huge fan of torture porn. And while I enjoy it, I don't want to watch people just get tortured to get tortured. That's why I have actually not seen any of the human centipedes, or I've not seen Raw or any of those because I like a little substance to my horror. I actually enjoy the element of being terrified. And when I watch anything, I will go in, even when we go to haunted houses. I love to be terrified. And technically, I should not go to haunted houses because all the things they write on there that you should not have before going in the haunted house, I have half of them. But I love the terror that comes with it. And for me, it's actually something of an element of I've lived through terror in real life. So having horror movies have their own sort of terror, it helps me escape from that. Um, the survival aspect. I love seeing someone survive. I like seeing anyone overcome whatever odds are out there and being able to come beyond it. And I think that's why I actually do enjoy tokusatsu as well. Even the series that are not horror related or have a lot of scary elements, when you look at tokusatsu, especially more so on the Kamen Rider side, because generally for Super Sentai, everybody is going to survive. That's kind of an expectation because it truly is made for younger kid audiences. Not saying that some of them weren't super hella violent, but they're truthfully made for kids. So everybody's expected to survive in tokusatsu in the modern era, I would say post Time Ranger. Um Only because of what happens with Time Fire. But I will say outside of that, Kamen Rider, it, there's no guarantee the people you start off the series with are going to be alive at the end of the series. You get that with Ryuki, you get that with Blade, Fies, especially the older series, you get a lot more of a kill count. And then when you go into like more of the modernist series, you had Gaim. Some of the characters in that series died. And it had its elements of horror because it's taking a lot of Japanese mythology and old style storytelling from Japan. So I truly enjoy it because I think it's important to know that every series, everything out there can have an element of horror. Now, those series have terror, absolutely. So if you look at anything live action Toku, you're going to have significant amounts of terror because that's how you have the monsters of the week really show their importance. So when you have a lot of Toku that is not very terrifying, Tokuger or Kyoger or anything like that, they they don't play around with yourselves all that much. Then when you have series like um actually I'm going to go with King Oger. King Oger has a lot of terrifying elements in it and I've really appreciated it. Or you could even go with I would say, like I mentioned, Revise. Dawn Brothers and Zenkaiger, I would say, are not terrifying. Their monsters of the week are definitely not what you want. But I overall I love it at the end anyways. Um I do agree with you, like I had mentioned earlier, Star Wars fan. Definitely laws were different in the 80s. So any kids in the 80s pretty much it was like wild wild west for kids because you had latchkey kids, you had kids who could pretty much get away with anything you want. As I said, I read a lot of Stephen King books in the 90s because nobody thought anything different of it here. um Let's see. I remember there was an O-Ranger episode where the monster captured little girls. Yes, I remember that episode. I was actually talking to Kaiju about one of my favorite Die Ranger episodes was or a two-parter was when the Jester was taking souls of people and putting them into dolls. I love that episode because one, I find porcelain dolls to be incredibly terrifying. And two, I thought the whole play on the story, the mystery, the fear with it, and not knowing if everybody that were housed in the dolls were still alive. I absolutely loved it. And then with Kaku Ranger, you had basically the entire series is horror themed in a way because you were dealing with scary stories from Japanese mythology. And you even have one of the villains, the Gashadokuro, who is Junior, who is basically horror everything. And so it's always fascinating when you have things like that. The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror series, that has truthfully gone downhill since I would say probably Treehouse of Horrors 9. It's nice to have that staple of the treehouse, but the challenge is that in the more modern Simpsons, like we have one that was anime focused. This one is going to be based on series that are not horror related and not scary. And that's my concern about continuing with Treehouse of Horrors is if you're going to take a lot of the fear out and a lot of the scariness out of it, it takes away a lot of the fun. And that's the thing I love about the Treehouse of Horror for the original ones. When you had the early on, you had The Shining, you had oh god, Amityville Horror. You had so many that just spoke to what people appreciated in horror at that time. And horror wasn't as accessible or as normalized as it is today. Because you have scary movies coming out for all ages. You have Paranorman, you have Coraline, you have Kubo. You have so many scary movies for kids that TV shows don't have much to scare you with anymore. And then Power Rangers Lost Galaxy, the Red Ranger and the manga or the Magna Defender went on a rescue mission to an alien ship only to discover the whole crew was killed by a monster. That is so cool. I didn't even know about that. I've actually not watched Lost Galaxy, or if I did, I don't remember. Um Actually, I don't think I watched it. But that's cool to know that Power Rangers actually took its own spin on Alien. And if you've not seen the original Alien, its tagline is "In space, no one can hear you scream." It was referencing actually the taglines from like going with Texas Chainsaw and Friday the 13th, where in the forest, no one can hear you scream. Um, and that all goes along the lines of the old saying, can't hear the forest from the trees, because sound is muffled when you have too much noise or too much around you. And then I do believe in the saying, and I love this comment of the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So it is true, and I do believe in that, but knowing that all humans have fears, and our fears are things that we've had since childhood based on something we watched, seen, or had done to us, or later in life we experience things. Like for me, clowns, there's multiple personal things that happened, but it was Tim Curry. Tim Curry was terrifying as a clown. And it fascinated me because I saw him as Frankenfurter, admittedly, once again, before I saw it. So Frankenfurter wasn't scary to me. Frankenfurter was like somebody I would talk to. And then going into watching it and having him play Pennywise, when they said they were remaking it, I'm like, who are you going to find that can be just as, or if not more terrifying than Tim Curry? And when I watched it a year before the new movies came out, I watched a miniseries with Kaiju, and he made the comment of, how is Tim Curry that terrifying? And it made me wonder, okay, were we all seeing it from the eyes of kids? Because everybody I've ever talked to that saw the miniseries saw it as a kid, except for the adults that were adults at that time. So we all build our own fears. Like I know people who are actually fearful of certain numbers, fearful of different things. Like I am actually extremely and probably neurotically afraid of being in small spaces. And that was because my evil cousin as a kid locked me in the closet. So I cannot be in confined spaces willingly or unwillingly. It's hard for me to get on a plane because a confined space where I'm locked into can make me very neurotic. Um, so yes, I agree. So Stranger Things is a horror mystery series set in the 80s. And having been a child of the 80s, I wasn't sure what to expect by Stranger Things because this is one of the challenges I have about especially getting older and the 80s are getting further and further away, watching people do things that represent a time period I lived through is so weird now because I now get what people feel when they watch movies depicting the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they lived through those eras. It's like, is this right? Is this just somebody's impression based off a movie they saw in the 80s or what have you? So I was super, super afraid that they were just going to focus, and they did to a degree, all of the cliches of what happened in the 80s. D&D coming out, the Ghostbusters, and having the metal music, having more of the arcade games. They went with some cliches, but they still kept it where people who lived in the 80s felt like, okay, this makes sense. And I think it's because of the creators of the show. But I always feel bad for kids or teens who are playing things from the 80s and they have absolutely no idea how any of this existed. I also thought the same thing when watching a couple of weeks ago the movie Totally Killer. It's a horror movie where her this one girl whose mother had multiple friends die in the 80s, and the girl sees that her mom got a letter and is killed, wants to go back in time to see if she can help everybody survive in the 80s. So she goes back to the 80s and she's looking at from a 2023 perspective. And she talks about how many of the things that we did in the 80s are so problematic in today's perspective. Like women making very male reference things, kind of sexualizing ourselves the way that men did. That was very prominent in the 80s and 90s. I'm not going to go into this whole social justice warrior crap. Not that it's crap, a whole social justice warrior thing, because every generation is going to look at things differently. And we agree and we disagree to certain extents. But Stranger Things is really great. I don't like some of their decisions that they've made in more recent seasons. I know why they've made them, but I'm not a huge fan of it. But for where it started and the purpose of it and what it was meant to be, it was great. It's kind of like watching the Fear Street movies that just recently came out that started in the current time, and then each respective sequel goes further and further into the past. Um, so they're making potentially a stage play of Paranormal Activity. So that I'm not too familiar with, but I wouldn't be surprised because they've been doing a stage play of Beetlejuice. They've done one of Evil Dead. And so them looking at others in stage play metrics, I wouldn't be surprised. In all honesty, I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know how it would work because the point of Paranormal Activity is to make it seem like everything was being done and you're just watching a recording of it as it's taking place. The challenge of trying to do a stage play of it is that the immersion of what found footage is supposed to be is lost. The only way I feel like they could make it work and still maintain that immersion is if they were do a stage play of Paranormal Activity, but have it where like it could affect the audience of if there's a haunting in the theater or the opera house or wherever it would be taking place, make it where it feels like it can affect everyone by having plants in the audience and things like that. If you don't know what plants are, any of the classic magic shows or even still magic shows to this day, you will have certain people in the audience that actually are working for the magicians to help bring some legitimacy to any of their tricks. It's not illegal. It actually helps with some of the fun elements. And I think some of the people's frustrations with it could be that it makes the magic trick seem moot and untrue, but that's the point of magic. If there are any true to life magicians that can do it and prove there are no plants, that would be awesome. But I've been to too many magic shows and have seen the plants. Um, to help find that Lost Galaxy episode, if anybody is interested, and I'll have to make Kaiju make me watch it, it's called The Rescue Mission. So I also think with that, it could also be not only could the Lost Galaxy episode where you're going into a ship that has no more crew, could also think of like Event Horizon, which is a great movie that takes in all of the elements I was talking about before. And hello, I like being called Mrs. Kaiju or Miss Kaiju. Um, it makes me laugh because we'll been together for 23 years this upcoming March. So it's making me feel super hella old because I we got together when I was 20 and I don't want to think about how old I am anymore. How would Michael Myers survive a zombie apocalypse? So I love this question. With the zombie apocalypse, I guess the question you would first have to ask yourself about Michael, and you could ask the same question about um, Jason and Freddy as well. Maybe not as much Freddy, but Jason is with the fact that they have so many sequels out there. Um, aren't they already zombies? But if we go with like their first movie, so Halloween is the first Michael Myers movie that has Michael. Friday the 13th Part 2 is the first one that has Jason. Hopefully, I have not spoiled anything for anyone. I'm not going to talk about who the killer is in the first Friday the 13th. But if when they're both alive, so I'm going to use when they're both living beings and not with their extensive amount of reincarnations. If I went that route, I actually think Jason would be better suited to survive a zombie apocalypse than Michael. The reason I say that is because Michael, if you think about it, he killed his sister when he was 6. So he had an entire emotional shutdown. And then he escapes the mental institution when he's 21, so 15 years later. Without any backstory, all one could think about Michael is that he's a 21-year-old with the mind of a child who just wants to go home. So I actually think he wouldn't survive, but he would take out a lot of zombies before he went down. Jason, on the other hand, I think he would survive greatly in the zombie apocalypse. If you think about what you learn in the first movie, with Jason being uh, a young man who is developmentally disabled, who is bullied, and subsequently ran away. And going into the second movie where he's in his 20s, I'm going to say 20s. I don't know how old he is. But if he's essentially in his 20s, I could actually see him surviving because if he survived for 5, 10 years on his own in the wilderness, he is already predisposed to being prepared for a zombie apocalypse. The only character I will say that I could for a fact guarantee would not survive a zombie apocalypse would probably be Ash. Ash's ego. He could deal with some deadites, but I don't think he could deal with an entire world of zombies. Um, hmm. Let's see. Hubby,
What?
come here. I want to get your opinion on the question.
What?
Do you think that Michael Myers could survive a zombie apocalypse?
Mm.
Wow, that was so.
He'd be a Michael zombie.
Well, I'm going with Halloween 1, where he's actually alive and has not been reincarnated like 50 times.
I have no idea.
Really? Wow. He is incredibly helpful. He actually is not as much of a horror fan as me. So most of this that you see on these shelves and the rest of our place is all my stuff. He only owns this much of horror. Let's see. I want to see what other kinds of questions we have here. So thank you for saying that age is nothing but a number. I truthfully do agree with that. My grandfather, up until before he passed away, always said, you're not old until you start feeling old. So the moment you start feeling old, that's when you're in old age. And except for very early in the mornings where my knees crack and make sounds as I'm walking around, I don't feel old. All righty.
Did you say age is just a number?
No! 80s XX Night said age is nothing but a number.
You mean box night?
Box Night. Is that what it is?
Age is just a number, so is 911.
Go away! So, Freddy Krueger, zombie apocalypse. I think he'd be bored. In all honesty, if you think about the entire Freddy franchise, he'd be bored. Because, actually, no. Not if he got into the dreams of any of the survivors. But see, this is the problem I have with the Walking Dead series. The Walking Dead became too much of a drama, more so about everything else than the zombies. Like, it didn't even play on the whole madness of people that much. Like, you had people building cities and cohabitating and building, like, governments and then dealing with the drama of that. And I'm like, but you're in a world that's dying. There should be a little bit more to it. So, hello, King Tyler. And for the question in the chat, are we ever going to have children? So, Kaiju Okami first is a giant child, and it would be hard for him to compete with an actual living child. But no, in all reality, sadly, I've had a few miscarriages, and I've actually had surgery due to some health reasons for precancer. So I physically can't have children. As for adopting, I think we're probably past the age where we could legally adopt. I'm not sure how it works. But the challenge with having kids is really my health. I want to make sure that if we do bring any children, we have a pet. And thankfully that's good. But actual regular children, that would be hard. But I do have nephews, nieces, godchildren. So we do have a lot of kids that we talk to. Well, many of those kids are actually adults now, but my eldest nephew is 11 years old. So he gets along really well with Kaiju because, once again, Kaiju is a giant child. But then again, so are all of the friends in our lives. However, I am termed the friend mom. If you if you ever want to see a funny ass video of what that means, watch the College Humor episode called Friend Mom. And that is essentially me. I am the one who mothers all of our friends. And I don't mind. People look to me as being the responsible. So, Anthony, yes. His favorite horror era is from the 70s. Oh, silent through the 70s. So we actually started watching a lot of silent films recently. Like I've seen Nosferatu, I've seen Metropolis, and I've enjoyed both of them. It was the first time that kaiju ever got to see Nosferatu, and I was very happy for him to be able to see Count Orlok, to really appreciate what people love about that movie, because it is considered a ripoff of Dracula, and that's because of, obviously, the estates didn't want to, or basically the movie didn't want to get sued by the Stoker estate. But we rewatched again the Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney Sr., and we also had the chance to watch Hunchback of Notre Dame, the silent film with Lon Chaney. We got to watch The Golem, which I actually love the Jewish folklore tale of the Golem. And I was very excited to see how they put that into play, how they explained how the golem worked, what it was made of, as well as for watching the silent film. The cinematography of what they were able to do, especially with having Beelzebub in it, it was it? Oh no, Asdrith in it, giving the ability to create the spirit was super super awesome. So I appreciate silent films. The 30s, 40s, and 50s. I like horror from that era because I do like the Universal. I like the Hammer, Hitchcock, so much others. But horror to me really felt like it hit its stride in the 70s. I love like Texas Chainsaw, to be quite truthful. This is another movie I saw way too young. It actually freaked me out a little bit because of the fact that it was the first time I dealt with anything that had to deal with cannibalism, or I watched anything that had to deal with cannibalism. And it actually is what created for me the genre name of Southern Comfort. Um, Southern Comfort isn't a real genre name for horror. It's actually called cannibal or cannibalism, but I call it Southern Comfort really because of this movie. The Wrong Turn series actually takes place in the Midwest, but this and The Hills Have Eyes both take place in the South. And having watched those movies when I was a kid, and knowing so many Southerners for good and bad reasons, and having drank Southern Comfort, because it goes down very hot and you feel like you're going to die, especially when you're too young drinking it. But so I call this stuff Southern Comfort horror. And when I watched this, the story of the family, especially with Leatherface is the most prominent character with the chainsaw. But this family, it's quite creepy because you have the dad, the brothers, the grandfather, and well, and you don't know if the dad's the dad or if he's what have you for the store owner, but it's so fascinating, and this is what really freaked me out when I got into torture, when I got to the era of seeing more torture porn. Now, torture porn has been around since the 70s as well, with Last House on the Left, which was very exploitation like. But this Black Christmas and then seeing Halloween, Friday the 13th, Alien, and I can go on because Kaiju just got me the one movie I really like from that time period of, you probably don't know what the movie is called, so I'm going to show you in a moment, but this is an Italian horror film that, well, because Italy made a lot of horror films like for Giallo and such with demons, and then House by the Cemetery. This is actually a non-American release because it's the only way I could get this series was from the UK. House by the Cemetery is another one of those movies that really plays with the mind and makes you think of what horror looks like when you look at it from different eyes. So my favorite era is truthfully the 70s. I love the 80s. The 90s, up until you got Scream, were hit or miss, unless you liked it just for the silliness of it. 2000s wasn't that good until the latter part, and then the 2010s, it feels like we're having a renaissance. Let's see. Do I agree that I and Kaiju make a great duo? I would actually say yes. And that's actually because even though we're technically husband and wife, it is done so for health insurance purposes. We actually never have gotten officially married. And the reason for that is really due to, one, my fear of never seeing a successful marriage work. And two, because the wedding that we would want would have to be crazy expensive. Because I've always said if I had a wedding, and I've said this since I was a kid, it would have to be horror themed. And that's just not feasible money wise. But we are a great duo because we do have a lot in common. We are also able to give ourselves space. One thing that makes a successful relationship, and you can kind of think of this on horror lines because a successful relationship, you have to have the mystery. You have to be able to survive with each other. And you have to be willing to acknowledge you're going to be terrified of one another when you find out your other habits. But in all reality, what has helped us is, well, one, I'm his first relationship, so he has nothing to compare me to. So in a way, that's a success for me. But for me, coming into a relationship, having a number of long-term relationships prior to that, um, is that he gave me the ability to feel like I could truly be myself. I didn't have to have any frills. I didn't have to hide my nerdisms. I didn't have to stop being me. Because some relationships, and I hear people talk about it all the time, of, well, I can't really show my partner that I'm a huge anime fan, or I can't do this around my partner because they don't like it. And while I respect that, and I think it is important that you have a balance of compromise, it's also important to be a good duo with your chosen partner to know that you both can do things on your own. I have never been afraid to say, hey, I want to watch this movie or play this video game or read this manga or watch this anime. And I've never been afraid to say, hey, do you want to do this with me? And if he were to say no, okay, I'm going to go do this, you do your own thing, and then we'll come back together later. That's what makes a successful duo. And so I know it's going to be dorky to say this. I truthfully do love. I've loved him for many, many years, kaiju, because of the fact that he lets me be as weird as I am. And I know that's saying something with how weird he is, but I truthfully am the weirder of the two. Um, but and hi everyone who's coming on. I'm so happy people are still here and joining me. Um, but at the end of it, if you want to have a successful relationship, don't stop being you. That's the end and all of it. You have to pretend to be somebody else at work. You have to pretend to be somebody else for your family half the time. You have to pretend to be somebody else for the random public so you don't get arrested. If you can't be yourself with your partner, then who in the hell are you going to be yourself with? So Anthony has recommended some other movies to take a look at. The Phantom Carriage and Haxon. So we actually do own Haxon. Every time Criterion or Arrow does like this whole big sale, I actually go out of my way to save up money and spend a ton of money buying obscure horror or horror that hasn't been released in a long time. And Haxon is really good. Another great, it's not silent. Well, actually it is silent. Never mind. This movie, oh no, it's German. This movie, Vampire, is an excellent German horror movie that really takes in this very obscure mannerism of having the black and white era, putting in the occult, and really playing with your mind on people, atmosphere, sexuality, and putting it all together to make you wonder what is right, what is wrong. Um, do I have a favorite Hammer film? So I actually have to say that is a hard one. Never actually thought about it because I've seen so many Hammer movies. And we actually got from Mill Creek, who is one of our sponsors, we actually got the Hammer film set that has Blu-rays of 20 of the various Hammer films that have been released over the decades. And I actually say the one that I really do like is the Gorgon. I've always loved anything on mythology. And even though the Gorgon isn't like a tried and true adaptation of mythology, the idea of it is so well done. Other than that, I will say I really like the Hammer Frankenstein movies. Um, they get kitschy later in the end, but like with the horror Frankenstein and things like that, it's so well done to see how they put together the story in a more modernized setting where they can use different practical effects that weren't even available 20 something years ago when they did Frankenstein through Universal during the Carl Laemmle era. Um, I will say I still love Boris Karloff versus Christopher Lee as Frankenstein, but I really did even love the portrayal of Christopher Lee, not as Frankenstein, as the monster. Sorry, I grew up in the era where everybody called Frankenstein the monster and not the doctor. I had to learn over the years that Frankenstein is the man, while the monster is just the monster. He has no name. Um, And the thriller anthology is really good for Hammer. I'm trying to think of what else I have watched. It's hard with Hammer because most times people think with Hammer, it's the revival of Dracula, Frankenstein. but there's so much more to Hammer. They've done hundreds of movies, very few of which have ever been released in the United States. They helped with the original Tales from the Crypt movie, even though it's not technically a Hammer film. And I'm not talking about the Tales from the Crypt with the Crypt Keeper in the US with Kassir doing the voice. There was an actual movie called The Tales from the Crypt back in the 70s. And so if you've not had a chance to watch it, it's actually very well done. It takes this occult, almost like satanic approach. And I think they did that really just to help with the storytelling of it. But it brings on a good question, like with your question, Star Wars fan, about anthologies, such as American Horror Story. So I have watched pretty much, except for like a couple of incomplete series, I have watched most of American Horror Story. I will say my favorite right now is still Murder House, with Coven being second and Roanoke being third. Roanoke is one of those that I know Kaiju hated because he did not like the documentary style of where you have the actual people telling the story and then you see dramatizations of it. But I've always enjoyed that because I love true crime. But American Horror Story is very nuanced. And you could actually see that more so with the American Horror Stories, which was taking on like little snippets of different of the horror seasons, where you had a lot of it took place in Murder House, but you had if it took outside of that. That I didn't like as much. I forced myself to get past the first episode of the most current American Horror Story called Delicate. And that's really because I'm not a huge fan of the Kardashians. And essentially, Kim Kardashian in the show is literally just playing herself. It is interesting to see her doing something different than just her reality TV show. But at the same time, I don't think that family is deserving of all the accolades they get. But I actually really do like anthology shows like Tales from the Crypt. I've always been a huge fan. Same thing with like the Goosebumps, Are Afraid of the Dark, and Erie, Pennsylvania. But I also like the horror movie anthologies like Trick or Treat or even the Christmas Horror Story and so many others. ABCs of Death are anthologies. VHS are anthologies. And the VHS, The Outer Limits, Twilight Zone, Night Gallery. The Outer Limits, especially the original series from the 60s, it's kind of a ripoff of the Twilight Zone because it's very similar, but the difference is it tells the stories very differently than how Rod Serling would have done it with the Twilight Zone. Rod Serling is a genius who I feel doesn't get enough accolades for what he's done for the horror genre. Him, Romero, Wes Craven, Toby Hooper, I think they deserve so much more accolades for horror and what they've done to help the genre become what it is. While Hitchcock has done a lot of horror, it's done very pulled back. and it's done more of the thriller aspects. And so those are great, but and I love Alfred Hitchcock. I just don't want to lump him in with horror because that's really not what his motif was about. Criminal Minds, I've actually watched that, but I never thought of that as horror. I could see where you could go with Criminal Minds. It's for anybody who is not familiar with Criminal Minds, it's one of the many series that started coming out after the rise of the situational sitcom where you take more of a mystery, um, legal drama, what have you, in so many different areas. Criminal Minds is a series where you have trying to think of the best way to explain it. It is like a situational cop drama, but I could see where you could go with some horror elements because of the way the one character who's like a triple PhD, I can't remember his name because I haven't watched enough of it, um, has done the show. Now, if I was going to go with like any of those cop dramas that would have a lot of horror themes to it, I would actually go more so with Bones because Bones, you're actually playing around a lot with the aspect of you're looking at people who have long since been dead and you're putting a lot of the forensic analysis with it, especially when you have the saga or the storyline with the killer that even tricks one of the heroes of the show to become their apprentice, which I thought was really great. X Files, the reason I haven't mentioned that for horror, even though technically it's qualified as sci-fi horror, is it's really more so on the sci-fi aspect than the horror. But X Files was a great show for even being able to do a progressive storyline. They're one of the few that I would say that, yes, it was a story of the week, but it went into a progressive where you actually saw the characters grow throughout the series. That really wasn't done because even with the Twilight Zone and Outer Limits, you had vignettes where you had one contained story for 30 minutes or an hour, depending on the season or series. And then you just kind of moved on to the next one. You never really saw those characters again, except for random one offs. Um, and then, oh, so so one of the comments is starting to watch the Hitchcock series. So the Hitchcock series is definitely horror thriller based. The Hitchcock series, which took place, I think, in the 60s and 70s. I could be wrong. It's been so long. Um, Alfred Hitchcock introduces each story of the week. He's not the one who writes them, but he presents them. And along those lines, he also kind of helped catapult having these hour-long shows where you could have somebody be a host like Rod Serling, but you could do it with characters in mind because Alfred Hitchcock was, if you think about having seen many, if you've seen any of his movies, he becomes a character in his own movies. Even if it's only for like a moment, he is a character in and of itself. So he actually he actually inspired others to do like Tales from the Dark Side, Creep Show. Um, yeah, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And then you got Freddy's Nightmares. You got the Friday the 13th series. There's so many out there. And I really always appreciated that. Now, actually, based on one of the comments here, one of the things I really haven't talked about was horror video games. And I know Kaiju is going to actually get into that a little bit more with a particular series he's doing. But I would love to see, like, I want to see a Capcom crossover fighter someday. I would actually like to see uh um a horror fighting game. There may be something, I just don't know, but where you have all of the big horror icons. You could have Jigsaw, you could have Freddy, Jason, Michael, Leatherface, and the Xenomorph. You could also have Sadako and Kayako and other horror icons, all being a fighting game motif, and kind of like Soul Cal or um God, even like DOA, have them where they all have their own techniques and see how they fight each other. Because that would be a great way to play off the whole who is stronger, Jason versus Michael, because they're essentially very similar to each other in different regards, or who is stronger between Freddy and Sadako, because both play with the minds there. I would love to see that. Yes, Mortal Kombat obviously is a horror element game, and I like Mortal Kombat. I don't play it as much as the rest of our friends do, but Mortal Kombat is like the premium horror genre game, especially for fighting. I have always been a fan of the horror games, even if I can't play them. Like when Last of Us came out, I bought the game for kaiju to play because I knew it would be way too hard for me to play because I'm not that strategic with fighting or with playing games. Like I play Uncharted, I play JRPGs and stuff like that, but certain games I know when to bow out. So I love games like that. I love Lollipop Chainsaw, Shadow of the Dam, those type of horror element games. And so video games are a great brewing ground for horror. And I'm not going to go too much further because I know Kaiju has something planned and I don't want to spoil that. With regards to video games. But with that said, I saw another comment about the death battle. They just did one on Jason versus Michael. I'm gonna have to look that up because I'll be really curious. It actually is making me wish there was more Celebrity Deathmatch where we could do more for the horror aspect. Celebrity Deathmatch was so fun back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then, have I played any of the Five Nights at Freddy's games? So I tried to one time and I just couldn't get into it. I don't know what it was. It's kind of like the whole Among Us thing. I think I tried it out well after all of the hype for it died down, and I couldn't get into it. However, Peacock, and I know it's coming out to theaters as well, is releasing the Five Nights at Freddy's movies on Friday. So since we have a Peacock account, I'm actually planning on watching the movie so I can at least experience something. Hopefully it's not bad. But if they learned anything from Willy's Wonderland, hopefully it's good. And I can finally get to know what's so good about Five Nights at Freddy's. Um, and yeah, Suda51 games for the win all the time, every day. Them and Atlas. But with that said, I am starting to lose a little bit of my throat. And we have probably more recording that we're going to be doing later, knowing my luck. So thank you all for joining me. Hopefully you enjoyed this. This is my first live stream by myself without Kaiju Okami. And I feel like I kind of floundered the first 10 minutes of it.
How so?
I feel like I probably bored everybody to death, and then I got more people, but it's not like you. But then again, your first one, you probably did terribly too.
Whatever.
But thank you, everyone. Hopefully you had fun. Hopefully you're having a great October. And I hope that you're enjoying a lot of different horror movies. So see you next time, and I'm going to try this again at some point. Bye.
End.
Hmm.